Okay, this is this, and I'm going to just make this video on Game Center on the Mac as quick as possible because my next video will probably be on DC Comics or just comics in general, because, well, well, not really the community, because it was none, but let's just say that it things didn't work out too well for DC Comics and their little reboot. I'll just say this: you ever wanted to see the kid who pretty much picked up the stick of dynamite and then lit it and just held it in his hand and wouldn't let go just to see what would happen? That's pretty much what's going on with DC and kind of Marvel. Now, as I said in previous videos, um, I'm fine with most of the so-called changes to the Mac OS 10 Lion. That doesn't bother me. What really kind of got on my bad side was hearing how people were like, "Oh, Game Center's coming to Mac. That means game developers are coming to Mac." No, it don't. It don't mean at all. In fact, that's some of the comments I was getting in my last video, and I'm going to just say this once and only once. The reason why there are so many games on the iOS devices is because it's popular. It's not as popular as the Android. I said Andrew. I mean Android. I mean the Android smartphone is just selling like hotcakes. But more gaming developers are actually going over to iOS. And yes, it's true that one of the main reasons is because of Game Center. But most people view the iOS devices as a gaming platform or a console, mini handheld console, which in technicality it is now. I mean, yes, the iPhone and the 3G version of the iPad is technically a handheld. I mean, it's both a kind of a smartphone and a handheld, while the iPod Touch and the Wi-Fi version of iPad is pretty much a handheld. And of course, anybody knows that the only reason why Apple put the game was forced finally to put Game Center on there, mainly because, well, they fucked up. And I know you can say, "Where's the proof?" Proof is just go look at the first generation iPod Touch. And I mean it. Just go look at the first generation and see all the features that came out with it and that were missing. No app store, no speaker, no camera. I know the camera finally came out in the last gen of iPod Touch, and no apps of any kind. Instead, you had like little like browser apps, and you can only go up like one page until finally you go up to many pages you want. But there was no way in hell that the first generation iPod Touch was ever developed for games. Actually, the hardware was developed for games, but the software, all you could really do was play a couple of web games and check your email, look at maps, and it was a fucking joke. I really mean it. The first generation iPod Touch was a fucking joke that many people had to jailbreak it just to make it do something besides being called an MP3 player. In fact, Steve Jobs originally called when the iPod Touch first came out, says it's nothing more than just a fancy iPod MP3 player, which turned out to be pretty false. But once that App Store came out, that's when the games started flooding in, and then Steve Jobs basically said, "Okay, this is a handheld gaming device." Of course, then he also quoted that Nintendo's going to die from this, whatever. And to make matters worse, the App Store came out for the iPhone first before it came out for the iPod Touch. And the iPad was the last one because, well, the iPad didn't exist back then. Anyways, about why I made this video. The only reason why all those, and I said this, the only real reason why gaming developers are making games for the iOS because of its popularity right now. and it's a pretty big margin right there. A lot of people are using it. That's a lot of eyeballs to play video games, and they're doing it. They're playing video games on it. But as for the Mac, trying to make it more iOS like, and putting Game Center on there, and Game Center being the biggest what the fuck are you thinking, Apple, for me, is this. Putting Game Center on the Mac doesn't mean that Infinity Blade or all the other games are going to just be automatically made, and then gaming developers are going, there's Game Center on this device on the Macs now. Let's make games for it right now. We have to. It's got Game Center. Let's forget about if it's more popular than, oh, I don't know, Windows or Steam. I mean, Steam got as many game developers to work on to put their games on the Steam network. Why? Because Steam became the popular one or popular digital way of downloading their games, as well as Windows itself, Microsoft Windows, which is a very popular platform to do what? Make games on. Why? Because there are a lot of gamers on there. Now, like for example, and I know this is going to kind of probably piss off some PC fanboys, but let's say Macs was insanely the more popular gaming platform, and it was widely more used than say um, PCs in general. Then gaming developers would be making a ton of games for Mac, regardless if it had Game Center or not. But instead, it's PCs. And before Microsoft even came out with Windows Live, and yeah, they took that from their own Xbox Live. But before they came out with Windows Live, games were coming out with it, and not very many gamers are even using Windows Live on their games. Gaming developers are using Windows Live on their games. Instead, most of them would rather just use Steam, but Steam uses Windows. So more gaming developers will go to Windows with Steam, or just have you go out and buy a CD for Windows. And the only other two non-handheld gaming platforms is right now the Nintendo Wii and the Xbox 360. And tons of gaming developers are going for those two systems, as well as the PS3, because the Sony fanboys won't shut the fuck up about, oh, you're not making games for my system. Your system sucks. Live with it, Sony. But yeah, just putting Game Center on Macs, it doesn't mean that gaming developers are going to go to Mac. Apple is going to have to put more on their plate if they're going to want gaming developers. And as I stated before, their current state of game platforming is shit. They don't have to make video games, but they have nothing to provide for gaming developers or anything out there. All they have is a handheld. That's all Apple has. Their Apple TV's a joke. Their Macs are not popular in gaming. It's a niche market within the gaming community. It's more popular on PC. Yes, it's easier to port games from the from the iOS to the Mac, but gaming developers would rather go straight to the Windows, even though it's harder, because Windows is just more popular and brings in more cash, as well as Steam. Unless you're going to go to try one of the new Windows 8 ARM processing computers, which will be locked down and will only let you install apps from the Windows App Store, and any other kind of apps will be uninstallable. But that's all I have to say. At some point, I'm going to have to make that video on DC Comics. Fuck.